Berlin, spring 1944. Deep inside the German High Command, a long conference table is buried under aerial photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and handwritten intelligence summaries. Cigarette smoke hangs heavy in the air. The room is silent. These officers are not debating the number of tanks. They are not discussing supply routes. They are not even talking about the Allied Supreme Commander. They are tracking one man. Every report on the table carries the same name, George S. Patton. To the German High Command. Patton was not just another enemy general. He was a problem that refused to stay still. A commander whose presence alone reshaped battle plans before a single shot was fired. By 1944, German intelligence devoted more resources to tracking Patton than any other officer, more than Eisenhower, more than Montgomery, because wherever Patton went, disaster followed. The Germans first encountered George S. Patton in November 1942, during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, a force of roughly 35,000 American troops assigned to land along the Moroccan coast and seize key ports, including Casablanca. On paper, this was a cautious mission. The Americans were untested. Their army had never fought a modern European power in large-scale ground combat. Even many Allied planners quietly expected mistakes. German commanders certainly did. Their intelligence assessments of the U.S. Army were shaped by stereotypes and observation. Americans, they believed, relied heavily on firepower, moved slowly, and lacked the ruthless tactical instincts developed through years of war. In German eyes, the U.S. Army would advance carefully, posing often, consolidating every gain, and waiting for orders to trickle down the chain of command. That was how Americans were supposed to fight, but Patton did not fight that way. From the moment his troops hit the beaches, Patton pushed relentlessly inland. He enforced strict discipline before the landing, steel helmets worn at all times, weapons ready, formations tight. He believed chaos at the start of an operation invited disaster, and he would not allow it. Units that bogged down were bypassed. Opportunities were seized immediately, not studied, not debated. Within 3 days, Casablanca had fallen. French resistance, expected to be stubborn and prolonged, collapsed far faster than German observers predicted. Patton's columns kept moving, pressing forward even when communications lagged behind. He trusted subordinate commanders to act on intent rather than wait for permission. Speed, Patton believed, created its own protection. To German intelligence officers monitoring the campaign, something felt wrong. American units weren't supposed to move like this. Reports began circulating up the Axis chain of command describing an unfamiliar pattern: rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, aggressive maneuvering without excessive preparation, and an uncanny ability to sense when an enemy position was brittle. Patton's forces attacked not where resistance was strongest, but where it was weakest. And they did so without hesitation. German analysts noted that Patton seemed to understand a principle their own generals prized: momentum mattered more than perfection. Once the enemy began to retreat, Patton gave them no time to recover. Every hour gained was another hour the enemy could not reorganize. Field Marshal Albert Kasserine, commanding Axis forces in the Mediterranean, took notice. Kasserine was no amateur. He had fought in Spain, Poland, and France. He had faced British commanders and knew their habits. This was different. The speed of the American advance did not match previous assumptions. Kasserine demanded more detailed intelligence. Who was commanding these troops? What was his background? Was this aggression a fluke or a sign of a new American style of warfare? For the first time, German commanders were forced to consider a troubling possibility that the Americans had found a general who did not fight like an American at all. And if that were true, they had just met an enemy who moved too fast to ignore. The intelligence files disturbed them. As German analysts dug deeper into the man now appearing again and again in their reports, a troubling picture began to emerge. George S. Patton was not an American general in the mold they understood. He had spent his entire career studying German military doctrine, not casually, but obsessively. He read German field manuals in the original language, absorbing their emphasis on movement, initiative, and decisive action. He followed the writings of Clausewitz and Moltke not as theory, but as guides for how wars were actually won. Patton walked the First World War battlefields of France, where German armies had come dangerously close to breaking the Western Front. He studied where they had succeeded and where they had failed. To him, maneuver warfare was not an academic concept discussed in staff colleges. It was something you felt in your bones. Speed, shock, and relentless pressure were weapons as real as tanks or artillery. That mindset collided with reality. In February 1943, at the Kasserine Pass, there in the mountains of Tunisia, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel smashed into inexperienced American units. Poor leadership, confused command structures, and rigid thinking led to disaster. Entire formations collapsed. Equipment was abandoned. It was the worst defeat U.S. ground forces would suffer during the war. German commanders watched closely. This was the moment they believed would reveal the Americans' true nature. Would they retreat? Pull back to safer positions? Spend months reorganizing and writing reports? Would the defeat shatter their confidence and confirm every assumption the Germans held about American weakness? Instead, they got Patton. Within weeks of taking command of the shattered U.S. Second Corps, Patton imposed order with brutal speed. He enforced discipline down to the smallest detail: uniforms worn correctly, weapons maintained, sentries alert. But beneath the surface rigidity was something far more important: clarity of purpose. Commanders were told exactly what was expected of them, then given the freedom to act. Morale surged. Soldiers who had been uncertain and defensive now moved forward with confidence. German reconnaissance soon reported something unsettling. American patrols were no longer timid. They probed aggressively, testing German positions, looking for gaps. Attacks came faster, often before German units had fully prepared. Patton was doing something the Germans recognized instantly. He was fighting the way they did. Rommel noticed immediately. The tempo of American operations had changed. They were no longer reacting, they were forcing decisions. Pressure came not in massive, predictable assaults, but in constant movement. Patton understood Rommel's own methods because he had studied them for years. For the first time, German commanders realized they were facing an American general who thought like a German and who was perfectly willing to use their own doctrine against them. Something had changed. Someone dangerous was now in command. In July 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. It was meant to be a carefully coordinated campaign, balancing British caution with American firepower. On paper, General George Patton's U.S. 7th Army had a supporting role. His mission was clear: secure Western Sicily and protect the flank of Field Marshal Bernard. Montgomery's British 8th Army as it advanced north and east toward Messina. Patton accepted the order, but he did not accept its spirit. Almost from the moment his troops came ashore, Patton saw opportunity where others saw boundaries. German and Italian defenses in western Sicily were brittle, poorly coordinated, and already straining under Allied air and naval pressure. Patton understood something instinctively. If he moved fast enough, the enemy would never have time to recover. What was supposed to be a protective maneuver became an offensive surge. His forces exploded. Across western Sicily, columns drove forward day and night, bypassing resistance, seizing crossroads, ports, and high ground before defenders realized they were under threat. Patton pushed his commanders relentlessly, demanding momentum above all else. Units that hesitated were replaced. Units that advanced were rewarded with greater freedom of action. Even Allied commanders were stunned. British planners, accustomed to methodical advances and carefully prepared assaults, struggled to keep up with the pace of Patton's movement. Maps were outdated almost as soon as they were printed. American units covered distances in hours that planners had allotted days. For German commanders on the island, the situation unraveled with terrifying speed. Evacuation plans, carefully staged withdrawals designed to preserve experienced troops began to collapse. Roads earmarked for orderly movement were suddenly under American control. Rear guards expected days to disengage found themselves with mere hours. Communications broke down as Patton's spearheads cut supply lines in command. Nodes. Patton was not simply advancing, he was racing the enemy's ability to think. As his 7th Army turned east and drove hard for Messina, the final escape route off the island, the pressure intensified. Every mile gained compressed the German timetable. Every captured port and road junction made evacuation more chaotic and costly. Then came the moment that shocked everyone. When Patton's lead elements entered Messina, they arrived before Montgomery's forces, despite starting farther away and being officially tasked with a secondary role. It was a humiliation for Allied egos, but a revelation for German analysts. German after-action reports were unusually blunt. Patton, they wrote, fought like a panzer commander. He accepted risks that American doctrine rejected. He did not wait for perfect conditions or overwhelming superiority. He exploited weaknesses immediately before defenses could react or reorganize. His operations were defined by speed, aggression, and relentless pressure principles. The Germans believed they had mastered seeing. Those principles turned against them by an American general was deeply unsettling. It meant their assumptions were wrong. It meant the enemy was learning faster than expected. And worst of all, it meant they were facing a commander who understood that in modern war, speed was not just an advantage, it was a weapon that terrified them. At the height of his success, Patton nearly destroyed himself. In August 1943, during visits to evacuation hospitals, Patton slapped soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The scandal exploded. Newspapers demanded his removal. Politicians called him unfit for command. German intelligence watched closely. They had identified Patton as the most dangerous Allied general. Now the Americans might remove him themselves, but Eisenhower did not fire Patton. He sidelined him, and the Germans noticed something even more troubling. The Americans were saving him. By early 1944, Patton was in England without a combat command. German intelligence tracked him obsessively. Why keep your best general idle before the greatest invasion in history? The answer seemed obvious. Patton must be commanding the main invasion force. What the Germans didn't know was that the 1st U.S. Army Group existed only on paper. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, wooden headquarters, but Patton was real. And wherever Patton was, the Germans believed the main attack would come. They fortified Calais. They stationed their best armored reserves there. And when the Allies landed in Normandy, German commanders hesitated. Waiting for Patton. On August 1, 1944, Patton finally entered the fight. The result was catastrophic for Germany. 3rd Army exploded out of Normandy, covering more ground in 2 weeks than other Allied forces had in 2 months. Defensive lines dissolved. German command structures collapsed. At Falaise, Patton nearly ended the war in France outright. German losses exceeded 50,000 captured, thousands killed, and the destruction of most remaining armored. German officers later said it was worse than Stalingrad, because Patton gave them no time. December 1944, Germany launched its last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. When Eisenhower asked how quickly commanders could counterattack, most spoke of weeks. Patton said 48 hours. He had already prepared. In winter conditions across icy roads, Patton turned an entire army 90 degrees and attacked. The relief of Bastogne shattered Germany's final hope. They had underestimated Patton again and again. They paid for it. After the war, when German generals were questioned in debriefings, memoirs, and private conversations, one topic surfaced again and again: which Allied commander had truly frightened them. The answers were strikingly consistent. Bernard Montgomery was respected but rarely feared. He was methodical, cautious, and predictable. His operations unfolded slowly, giving the German high command time to anticipate his moves. Omar Bradley was viewed as competent and careful, a commander who minimized risk and avoided unnecessary gambles. Dangerous, yes, but manageable. George S. Patton was something else entirely. Patton's name carried a different weight in German headquarters. He was described with words that betrayed unease: unpredictable, reckless, relentless. German officers struggled to define him because he did not fit neatly into their expectations of how an American general should fight. He did not pause to consolidate. He did not wait for perfect supply lines or textbook formations. He attacked first, adjusted later, and drove forward even when logic suggested stopping. What truly disturbed German commanders was that Patton fought war the way they themselves believed it should be fought. German military doctrine had long emphasized Blitzkrieg war of movement. Speed, shock, and continuous pressure were the pillars of their early successes in Poland, France, and the opening stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Blitzkrieg relied not just on tanks and aircraft, but on tempo, striking faster than the enemy could react, breaking cohesion before resistance could harden. Patton understood this instinctively. Where other Allied commanders sought balance and caution, Patton sought momentum. Once his Third Army broke through in France, it did not slow down, it exploded outward. German defensive plans collapsed not because they were poorly designed, but because Patton moved faster than their orders could travel. Divisions were flanked before they knew an attack had begun. Rear areas were suddenly front lines. German units found themselves fighting not where they had prepared to fight, but where Patton had decided they would fight. This created something the German army feared deeply: chaos. Patton thrived in chaos. He believed confusion was a weapon, and he wielded it mercilessly. While German commanders attempted to re-establish order, Patton was already 3 steps ahead, exploiting gaps, forcing retreats, and turning tactical victories into operational disasters. His advances felt less like traditional offensives and more like avalanches, unstoppable once they began. Equally unsettling was Patton's disregard for conventional doctrine. German generals were trained to recognize patterns: build-up, probing attacks, pauses for resupply. Patton broke those patterns. He attacked when logic suggested he should rest. He advanced when fuel was scarce. He shifted directions abruptly, forcing German commanders to guess rather than plan. Facing Patton meant constantly reacting, never controlling the tempo. And in war, losing control of tempo often meant losing everything. There was also a psychological dimension. Patton projected aggression as a form of warfare. His reputation raced ahead of his tanks. German intelligence reports exaggerated his strength, believing his formations larger than they were. Even Hitler himself fixated on Patton, convinced that wherever Patton appeared, a decisive blow was coming. The Allies exploited this fear through deception. But the fear itself was genuine. German generals did not fear Patton because he was flawless. They feared him because he was dangerous. He accepted risks sometimes recklessly, but always decisively. And in a war where hesitation could be fatal, Patton's willingness to gamble made him lethal. In the end, Patton was terrifying not because he ignored the rules of war, but because he understood them too well. He fought the kind of war German generals respected most, and by the time they realized that, it was already too late. War is not won by numbers alone. It is won by those who understand momentum. Fear and the cost of hesitation. George S. Patton understood all three, and that is why the generals who once conquered Europe learned what it felt like to face a commander who fought exactly like them, only better. If stories like this matter to you, stories where history is shaped not by myths, but by decisions made under impossible pressure, then stay with us, because the past still has lessons to teach. And some of them were written at full speed.